The Vietnam War, a conflict that defined a generation and reshaped global politics, wasn't just a clash of armies or ideologies. It was a story driven by powerful, determined individuals whose decisions, ambitions, and fears steered the course of history. From the jungles of Vietnam to the halls of the White House, their choices created a ripple effect that we still feel today. So, who were these key players? How did their actions lead to one of the most divisive wars of the 20th century? Let's dive into the 5 figures who shaped the Vietnam War. Our story begins with a man whose name is synonymous with Vietnamese independence, Ho Chi Minh. Long before the American helicopters arrived, he was a revolutionary, a nationalist, and a communist leader dedicated to a single goal: freeing Vietnam from foreign control. For decades, he fought against French colonial rule, envisioning a unified and independent nation. When the U.S. stepped in to support the French, and later the government of South Vietnam, he saw it not as a fight against communism, but as yet another obstacle to his country's sovereignty. His anti-colonial ideology was the bedrock of the resistance. It wasn't just political theory, it was a powerful, emotional call to action that rallied millions to his cause. He founded the Viet Minh, a nationalist independence coalition, and later led North Vietnam. His unwavering determination to reunify the country under his rule set the stage for a long and brutal conflict, making him the ideological heart of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong war effort. Across the Pacific, another leader was watching Southeast Asia with growing alarm. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower saw the world through the lens of the Cold War, a global chess match against the Soviet Union. In 1954, he introduced a concept that would define American foreign policy for decades: the domino theory. He feared that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably topple one after another, like a row of dominoes. Vietnam, in his eyes, was the first domino. It was a critical front line in the fight to contain communism. This theory wasn't just an abstract idea, it became the primary justification for America's deepening involvement. Eisenhower's administration began pouring massive amounts of financial and military aid into creating and supporting a non-communist state in the South, the Republic of Vietnam. His decisions laid the financial and strategic groundwork for the war, committing the United States to a path from which it would be difficult to retreat. The man the U.S. chose to lead this new nation of South Vietnam was Ngo Dinh Diem. A staunch anti-communist and a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, Diem seemed like the perfect partner for Washington, but his rule quickly became a source of major instability. His government was plagued by accusations of rampant corruption and nepotism, with key positions given to his family members. Worse, his administration was incredibly repressive. He cracked down on political opponents and implemented policies that alienated the rural population and discriminated against the Buddhist majority. This widespread public dissatisfaction became a powerful recruiting tool for the communist insurgency in the South, known as the Viet Cong. Instead of uniting the South against the North, Diem's controversial leadership deepened the internal divisions, creating a fragile and fractured state. This internal weakness made South Vietnam increasingly dependent on American support, and ultimately proved to be a critical factor that complicated the war effort from the very beginning. Following Eisenhower, President John F. Kennedy inherited the simmering conflict in Vietnam. He, too, was a firm believer in containing communism and saw Vietnam as a crucial test of America's resolve and credibility on the world stage. Under his administration, the American presence in Vietnam grew significantly. While he resisted sending in large numbers of combat troops, he dramatically increased the number of U.S. military advisors from a few hundred to over 16,000. These advisors were there to train and equip the South Vietnamese army. Kennedy's approach represented a policy of gradual escalation. He was deepening America's commitment, hoping that a limited intervention could be enough to prop up the Diem government and defeat the Viet Cong. But the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate. Kennedy's policies, while intended to be a measured response, effectively pushed the United States further down the path toward a full-scale war, setting the stage for the massive military intervention that would come next. The president who would ultimately make that fateful decision was Lyndon B. Johnson. Thrust into the presidency after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson inherited a Vietnam policy in crisis. He felt immense pressure to not be the president who lost Vietnam to communism. In August 1964, an event in the Gulf of Tonkin provided him with the justification he needed. Johnson claimed that North Vietnamese patrol boats had launched an unprovoked attack on a U.S. destroyer. Using this incident, he persuaded Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted him broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. This was the turning point. Johnson began a massive escalation, authorizing Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and sending the first U.S. combat troops to Vietnamese soil in 1965. Over the next few years, the number of American soldiers skyrocketed to over 500,000. Johnson's decisions transformed a limited advisory role into a full-scale American war, making him the figure most associated with the height of the conflict and its immense human cost. From Ho Chi Minh's unyielding quest for independence to Lyndon Johnson's tragic decision to escalate, these 5 leaders were the architects of the Vietnam War. Their personal beliefs, political calculations, and strategic fears intertwined to create a conflict that left deep scars on Vietnam, the United States, and the world. Understanding their roles is key to understanding why the war happened, how it unfolded, and why its legacy endures. Ever wondered how a small nation like Vietnam could stand against a global superpower? It wasn't just about battles. It was a complex web of strategy, covert ops, and global politics. Let us dive into the masterminds and key players who shaped one of the most defining conflicts of the 20th century. First, let's talk about General Vo Nguyen Giap, the brilliant architect of North Vietnam's military strategy. He wasn't just a general. He was a master of unconventional warfare. Giap understood that he couldn't win a head-on fight against the technologically superior American forces. So, what did he do? He chose a different battlefield: time and willpower. His strategy was simple yet devastatingly effective: long-term guerrilla warfare. The goal wasn't to win every battle, but to wear down the U.S. forces, to make the war so long, costly, and painful that American public opinion would turn against it. Giap prioritized psychological and political pressure over purely tactical victories. He famously said that weakening American willpower was far more crucial than dominating the battlefield. Every campaign he designed was meant to prolong the conflict, to create a constant state of uncertainty, and drain American resources and morale. This relentless pressure forced the United States to constantly reassess its commitment, creating a strategic quagmire that military might alone couldn't solve. It was a war of attrition, not of territory, but of the human spirit. Operating on the ground, carrying out Giap's vision, was the Viet Cong. This wasn't just another army. The Viet Cong was a communist-aligned guerrilla force, deeply embedded within South Vietnam itself. They were masters of disguise, blending seamlessly with local populations. One day, a farmer working in the rice paddies. The next, a fighter launching a surprise attack. Their tactics were textbook guerrilla warfare, sabotage, ambushes, and targeted assassinations. But their impact went far beyond military disruption. They ran sophisticated political influence campaigns, winning the hearts and minds of villagers and creating a powerful shadow government. This made the war incredibly complex for the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. How do you fight an enemy you can't even see? The Viet Cong effectively turned the conflict into an internal civil struggle, undermining the authority of the South Vietnamese government from the inside. They were a constant, invisible threat that destabilized the entire region, proving that in this war, the front line was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Now let us shift our focus to Washington and a key figure who dramatically altered the course of the war: Richard Nixon. Elected on a promise to end the war, his policies were a paradoxical mix of de-escalation and expansion. He introduced a policy called Vietnamization, a strategy to gradually withdraw U.S. troops and shift the combat responsibility to the South Vietnamese army. The idea was to achieve peace with honor. But while pulling troops out of Vietnam, Nixon secretly expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos. He authorized massive, clandestine bombing campaigns to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a critical supply route for North Vietnam. These actions were intended to pressure Hanoi into negotiating a favorable peace deal. However, the expansion had devastating consequences, destabilizing the entire region and leading to years of chaos, particularly in Cambodia. Nixon's policies were a high-stakes gamble, prolonging the conflict and increasing its scope, all while trying to orchestrate an American exit. It was a complex and controversial chapter that showed just how entangled the U.S. had become. Of course, North Vietnam wasn't fighting alone. It had powerful allies, the Soviet Union and China. Their support was the backbone of Hanoi's ability to sustain such a long and grueling war. They saw Vietnam as a crucial front in the global Cold War, a proxy battleground to challenge American influence without direct confrontation. Both communist giants provided a steady flow of weapons, from assault rifles to surface-to-air missiles, which helped counter America's technological advantage. They also offered extensive training for North Vietnamese soldiers and provided billions of dollars in financial and economic aid. This support was a lifeline, allowing North Vietnam to absorb the immense damage from U.S. bombing campaigns and continue its resistance. Essentially, the involvement of the Soviet Union and China transformed a regional conflict into a global showdown. Their support balanced the scales, ensuring that no matter how much military power the U.S. deployed, North Vietnam would never be completely overwhelmed. It was a classic proxy war, with Vietnamese soldiers fighting and dying using foreign weapons and funds. But U.S. involvement didn't start with combat troops. Long before the first Marines landed, a different kind of American was on the ground. Military advisors and CIA operatives. In the early stages, these figures played a critical role in shaping U.S. strategy, often with mixed results. U.S. military advisors were sent to train and equip the South Vietnamese army, hoping to build a force capable of defending itself against the communist insurgency. Meanwhile, the CIA was running a shadow war. They launched covert operations, counterinsurgency programs like the Phoenix program, and intelligence-gathering missions. The problem was, these early operators often had a poor understanding of the local culture, politics, and historical dynamics. Their assessments were frequently flawed, painting an overly optimistic picture or misinterpreting the nature of the insurgency. These intelligence reports, sent back to Washington, heavily influenced political decisions, often leading policymakers down a path of deeper and deeper commitment. These covert operations and advisory roles created a slippery slope. They gradually deepened American involvement, creating political and military obligations that made it harder and harder to pull back. Before the U.S. even realized it, it was neck-deep in a conflict that its own covert actions had helped escalate. From the strategic genius of General Giap and the grassroots resistance of the Viet Cong to Nixon's gambles and the Cold War proxy games, the Vietnam War was far more than just a series of battles. It was a collision of ideologies, strategies, and cultures. Understanding these key players helps us see the conflict not as a simple story of good versus evil, but as the complex, tragic, and deeply human event that it was. Thanks for watching, and if you found this deep dive interesting, be sure to like and subscribe for more historical analysis.